She was not the bride he thought he married. He discovered it on their wedding night, and instead of fury, what he felt was something far more dangerous. This is the story of a swap no one was meant to survive unscathed, a marriage built on a lie neither of them could confess, and the 4 words that finally ended it. I knew from the first night. The Ashdown townhouse smelled of beeswax and panic. Lady Rosalind Ashdown stood in the doorway of her sister's bedchamber, watching Seraphina throw gowns into a trunk with the frantic, silent efficiency of a woman who had already decided her life could not survive the morning. "You cannot do this," Rosalind said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I cannot marry him, Ros." Seraphina didn't look up. Her hands shook as she folded a traveling cloak. "I would rather die in a ditch with Thomas than live in a castle with a man who looks at me like I'm an item on an inventory. He is a duke. You will not die in a ditch. I will die somewhere far worse, then. Slowly. Over 40 years. Seraphina finally turned, and Rosalind saw that her twin's eyes were red-rimmed but entirely resolved. "Thomas has secured passage. We leave within the hour, before father wakes." Rosalind and Seraphina had been born 11 minutes apart and had spent 23 years being mistaken for one another by everyone except their own mother, who had died when they were 9, and their father, who had never particularly bothered to learn the difference. It had made them close in the particular, fierce way of people who had only ever truly had each other. It also meant that when Seraphina said, "You have to be me tomorrow, just for the ceremony, just until I can write and confess it myself once I'm safely away," Rosalind understood, with a sinking, inevitable certainty, that she was not actually being asked. "Father will kill you when he finds out," Rosalind said. "Father will kill you, if he learns you let me go instead of marrying the Duke yourself. So you'd best make certain he never learns anything at all." Seraphina caught both of Rosalind's hands in hers, and for a moment the frantic packing stopped entirely. "You always said you didn't care for romance. That you'd rather have a quiet, sensible arrangement than a marriage built on nerves and roses. Well, here is your quiet, sensible arrangement, sister. I'm only asking you to walk into it 11 minutes early." It was, Rosalind would think later, exactly the kind of argument only a twin could make, using her own words against her with perfect, devastating accuracy. "He'll know," Rosalind said. "The moment he looks at me, he'll know I'm not the woman he proposed to. He's met me exactly 3 times, in rooms lit by 20 candles, through a veil of my own perfectly rehearsed nonsense. He does not know me, Ros. Nobody does, except you." Seraphina pressed a folded letter into her sister's hand. "Give him this once you're settled, if your conscience won't let you carry the lie forever. But give our family 1 more month of respectability first. That's all I ask. 1 month, and then I'll write to him myself and take the blame entirely." Rosalind looked down at the letter in her hand, and then at her sister's trunk, half-packed for a life neither of their father nor society would ever forgive. 1 month, she said. It was, of course, a lie the moment she said it. She already knew she would not be able to hold to it. The Duke of Thornfield, Alexander Vane, stood at the altar of a fashionable London church the following morning entirely unaware that the bride approaching him down the aisle bore a different name than the one he had signed on the marriage settlement 3 weeks prior. He had met Lady Seraphina Ashdown exactly as she'd described, 3 brief, chaperoned meetings, each conducted with a bright, performative charm that had struck him, even at the time, as slightly rehearsed. He had not minded. He required a wife of good birth to manage his estates and satisfy the terms of his late father's will before the year turned, and a woman with a talent for performance seemed, if anything, well suited to the role society expected of a duchess. He was 31, tall, with the kind of watchful stillness that came naturally to men who had spent a decade managing land, tenants, and a mountain of debts left behind by an indifferent father. His eyes were a sharp, pale green, and they had a habit of settling on people with an intensity that made most of London's drawing rooms distinctly uncomfortable. When the bride reached him at the altar and lifted her veil, something in his gaze paused, the faintest hesitation, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. She looked, of course, exactly like the woman he'd proposed to. She was, after all, her twin. But her eyes did not perform delight at seeing him. They held something quieter, a careful, private steadiness he hadn't noticed in their previous meetings. Grief, perhaps, he told himself. Or nerves. He filed the observation away and thought no more of it. Lady Seraphina, he murmured. Your Grace, Rosalind answered, and did not let her voice shake. The ceremony passed in the usual blur of Latin and echoing footsteps. When he slid the ring onto her finger, his hand was cold and remarkably steady, and Rosalind found herself staring at his knuckles rather than his face, terrified that if she looked up, he would see straight through her. They left the church in a closed carriage, bound for Thornfield Abbey in Kent. Alexander opened a leather folio of estate correspondence almost the moment they were seated, and Rosalind, watching him, felt the first small, treacherous flicker of relief. If he meant to ignore her for the duration of the journey, she would have time to become someone else entirely. Thornfield Abbey rose out of the Kent countryside like something built to outlast weather, fashion, and time itself. Grey stone, ivy climbing one entire wing, tall narrow windows that caught the last of the autumn light like watching eyes. Rosalind thought it was the most honest-looking house she had ever seen, entirely unconcerned with being pretty. The staff lined the entrance hall in careful, practiced rows. At their head stood a tall, silver-haired housekeeper who introduced herself as Mrs. Halloway, her expression giving away nothing. Welcome to Thornfield, Your Grace, she said, with a precise curtsy. Thank you, Rosalind said, and hoped her voice sounded enough like her sister's, bright, easy, unbothered, to pass. Alexander did not linger in the hall. Show her Grace to her rooms. We'll dine at 8. He offered Rosalind a brief nod and disappeared down a long corridor, already returning to whatever business consumed a man with 1,000 acres and 2 years of neglected ledgers. Rosalind exhaled slowly, standing alone amid strangers in a house that was now, on paper, entirely hers. Dinner that evening was conducted across an absurd length of polished mahogany, illuminated by silver candelabras, in a silence so complete that Rosalind could hear her own heartbeat over the scrape of cutlery. She picked at a plate of roasted partridge, her stomach far too tight with dread to manage more than a few bites. The wedding night loomed over the meal like a held breath. She had, of course, discussed the general theory of a wedding night with Seraphina in Girlhood Whispers, the way all young women did, half-informed, mostly terrified. But the actual, physical reality of it, with a stranger she had deceived into marrying her, made her hands unsteady around her fork. You've eaten almost nothing, Alexander observed, not looking up from his own plate. I'm not especially hungry, Your Grace. You should eat something. The kitchen will learn your preferences in time, if you tell them what they are. He glanced up then, and something in his gaze sharpened. You've barely spoken tonight. In London you hardly stopped. Rosalind's pulse spiked. I find I have little appetite for performance today, Your Grace. It has been a very long one. Something flickered behind his pale green eyes, not suspicion, not yet, but a kind of recalibration, as though he were quietly filing away a discrepancy he could not name. Fair enough, he said, and to her relief, did not press further. He set down his own fork. I'll be in my study until 11. I'll come to your rooms after. The number landed like a verdict, exactly as she'd feared it would. By 10:30, a soft-spoken maid named Prudence had brushed out Rosalind's dark hair and helped her into a plain cotton nightgown, entirely too thin for the drafts finding their way through the old stone walls. Alone, Rosalind paced the length of the room, listening to the wind outside and the distant, unfamiliar creak of a house she did not yet know how to read. Tell him tonight, a voice in her head insisted. Confess it before it goes any further. He is a reasonable man. He will be angry, but he will manage it quietly, and Seraphina will be safely away, and you will simply go home. But she thought of her father's face if the truth emerged, the ruin it would bring down not only on Seraphina, but on the family name entirely, on whatever chance her younger sisters still had at respectable matches. And she thought, too, though she would not admit it even to herself that night, of the small, sharpened attention in Alexander's eyes at dinner, the way he had noticed something was different about her without yet knowing what. 1 month, she told herself. You promised her 1 month. The knock, when it came, still made her flinch. Come in, she managed. He entered without his coat or cravat, only a linen shirt open at the collar, and stopped a careful distance from the bed. He looked, stripped of the formal armor of London tailoring, considerably younger than he had at the altar, and considerably more uncertain than she'd expected of a man reputed to be entirely without sentiment. "You look as though you're bracing for a magistrate," he said, setting down 2 glasses and a small decanter of brandy. He poured, and held one out to her. "Drink." She crossed the room and accepted it, her fingers brushing his. The brandy burned a warm path down her throat. "I am aware," he said, turning to look into the fire rather than at her, "that this marriage was arranged with more urgency than sentiment. I don't imagine either of us chose it purely from the heart." "No," Rosalind said quietly, and it was, at least, entirely true. "I won't pretend to romantic feeling I haven't yet earned," he went on. "But I would like, if you're willing, for this to be a partnership rather than merely an arrangement." Rosalind's throat tightened. He was being decent, quietly, deliberately decent, to a woman he did not know was not the one he'd proposed to, and the unfairness of it settled over her like a physical weight. He set down his own glass and stepped closer. Rosalind's back met the bedpost before she realized she had retreated. The flinch was instinctive. He stopped instantly, watching her white-knuckled grip on the brandy glass, the rigid line of her shoulders. "I have no intention of frightening you," he said, low. "Whatever you were told to expect of me, whatever London whispered, I would rather you judge me by what actually happens in this room and nowhere else." His hand, when it came, did not grasp. It settled against her shoulder, warm and unhurried. "May I stay?" he asked. Not "may I continue," she noticed distantly, but something gentler, an offer rather than a request for permission to proceed. "Or would you rather I returned to my own rooms and gave you the night to simply rest?" Rosalind looked up at him, at this careful, watchful stranger who had every legal right to demand anything of her and was, instead, standing at a careful distance, waiting for an answer he seemed entirely prepared to accept either way. She thought of her sister, somewhere on the road to Scotland with a man she actually loved. She thought of the letter folded in her trunk, still unsent. And she thought, with a small, treacherous ache, that she did not want him to leave. "Stay," she whispered. The bed was still warm on his side when Rosalind woke, though he himself had already gone. She lay still for a long moment, cataloguing the strange, unfamiliar quiet of the house, and the equally strange fact that she felt no shame at all in what had passed between them the night before, only a complicated, guilty gladness that made the deception sitting beneath it all the more unbearable. A note waited on her vanity, in sharp, economical handwriting. "The east-facing rooms hold the morning sun better than these. I've asked Mrs. Halloway to have your things moved, if you'd prefer them. The household accounts are yours to review whenever you wish. I imagine, given time, you'll find plenty to correct in them. A. Not a love letter. But not merely an instruction, either." Rosalind read it twice, and felt something in her chest tighten with an emotion she did not have a safe name for yet. By midweek, she had, indeed, found plenty to correct. Sitting in the estate office with Mrs. Halloway's ledgers spread before her, Rosalind discovered a household running on inertia rather than sense, a butcher overcharging by a third, coal deliveries shorted by a careless merchant, menus planned for twice the number of people actually residing at Thornfield through the winter months. She had spent her whole life managing her father's chaotic, debt-ridden household in the absence of any real maternal guidance. Correcting Thornfield's accounts felt, oddly, like coming home to a skill she hadn't known she'd need again. Alexander found her there on the 4th afternoon, ink-stained and frowning over a column of figures. "You've rewritten half of Halloway's ledger," he observed, not quite a question. "Your butcher has been overcharging this house for years, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected, the way he had the night before, quietly, without making a point of it. "And I gathered as much, from the state the accounts were left in when I inherited them. My father was not a details man." He studied her for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "You didn't manage figures like this in London. I don't recall you ever speaking of ledgers at all." Rosalind's pulse spiked. London conversation rarely leaves room for anything so unfashionable as arithmetic, Your Grace. "Alexander," he said again, and something in his gaze lingered on her a beat too long before he let the matter drop. "Well, Thornfield is fortunate you've a hidden talent for unfashionable things." He left without further comment, But Rosalind noticed, over the following days, that he had begun watching her with a new, careful attention, not suspicion exactly, not yet, but the quiet cataloguing look of a man assembling a puzzle one piece at a time. Weeks folded into a settled, companionable rhythm. There were no grand declarations, no poetry, only long hours in the estate office, ink-stained fingers, low conversation over shared work that neither of them seemed in any hurry to end. Alexander was, Rosalind discovered, nothing like the cold, transactional figure London gossip had painted him as. He was patient with his tenants, fiercely protective of the people who depended on Thornfield's land, and possessed a dry, understated humor that surfaced only when he'd forgotten, briefly, to guard himself. She found herself, against every warning her own conscience offered, falling in love with a man who believed he had married someone else. The lie sat in her chest like a stone she carried everywhere, growing heavier with every week that passed without confession. Twice she wrote to Serafina, begging for news of her whereabouts and pressing, gently, for permission to tell Alexander the truth sooner rather than later. Twice the replies came back vague and delayed. Serafina and Thomas were still traveling, still arranging their own quiet Scottish wedding, still asking for a little more time before the scandal broke. One evening in late November, working late in the study, Alexander crossed behind Rosalind's chair and set his hands, unbidden, against the tight knots gathered in her shoulders. "You work too hard," he murmured. "I'm only matching your pace. We can afford a slower one, now and then." His thumbs found a particularly stubborn knot, and she let out an involuntary, grateful sigh. "You've changed since we married, Serafina." The name landed like a slap. Rosalind went very still beneath his hands. "Changed how?" she asked carefully. "You laugh differently now," he said, thoughtful rather than accusing. "In London, your laugh had an edge to it, performed, almost, for whoever was watching. Here, it's—" He paused, searching for the word. "Quieter. True, I think. I find I much prefer it. I only wonder what changed." Rosalind closed her eyes, guilt closing over her throat like water. "Perhaps," she said, very carefully, "I simply feel less need to perform here than I did in London." It was, she told herself, not entirely a lie. It simply wasn't the whole truth either. Alexander's hands stilled on her shoulders. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I find," he said finally, quiet and deliberate, "that I like this version of you considerably more than the one I proposed to." Rosalind turned in her chair to look up at him, and the ache in her chest sharpened into something close to physical pain. "Tell him," the voice in her head insisted, louder now than it had been in weeks. "Tell him now, while he's looking at you like this, before it becomes impossible to tell him at all." She opened her mouth, and the study door opened instead, Mrs. Halloway announcing, with visible unease, that a Lord Ashton had arrived unannounced, demanding to see his daughter at once. Rosalind's father stood in the drawing room in travel-worn London finery, his face flushed with wine and barely restrained fury. "Ooh," he said the moment she entered, his eyes narrowing with a recognition no one else in the house had yet managed. "Rosalind." The room went very cold. Alexander, following a step behind her, stopped dead. "Father," Rosalind started. "Where is your sister?" Lord Ashton demanded, ignoring her entirely, his attention swinging to Alexander with an expression caught somewhere between panic and calculation. "Your Grace, I must apologize most profoundly. There has been a substitution, entirely without my knowledge, I assure you." "A substitution," Alexander repeated, very quietly. His gaze moved from Lord Ashton to Rosalind, and she watched, with a sick, sinking dread, every piece of the puzzle he'd been slowly assembling for weeks finally click into place. "You are not Serafina." It was not a question. "No," Rosalind said, and found, in the end, that the confession she had dreaded for a month came out steadier than she expected. "My name is Rosalind. Serafina fled the night before our wedding, with a man she loved, and I stood in her place at the altar because I did not know how else to save my family from ruin. I have been your wife in name for a month under a lie I should have confessed the very first morning, and I am sorrier for that than I can say." The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Ashton began some blustering explanation, but Alexander cut him off with a single, sharp gesture. "Leave us," he said, not looking away from Rosalind. Both of you may discuss the settlement's legal particulars with my solicitor tomorrow. Tonight, I would speak with my wife alone. Lord Ashton, thoroughly cowed, retreated. Rosalind stood alone with Alexander in the drawing room, her heart hammering, waiting for the anger she felt she'd more than earned. It did not come the way she expected. "A month," Alexander said finally, his voice rough. "You have been lying to me for a month, Rosalind." "Yes. And the wedding night. The ledgers. The laugh I told you I preferred." He stopped, something raw crossing his face. "All of it was you. Not her. You, the entire time." "Yes," Rosalind said again, bracing herself. Alexander crossed the room in 3 long strides, and for one terrible moment Rosalind thought he meant to walk straight past her, out the door, out of the marriage entirely. Instead, he stopped directly in front of her, searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then I have not spent the last month falling for a woman who does not exist," he said slowly, as though working the thought out loud for the first time. "I have been falling for you. The real laugh. The real ledgers. The real woman standing in front of me right now." "You should be furious," Rosalind said, her voice cracking. "I deceived you. I let you believe." "I am furious," Alexander said, and something in his voice suggested it was true, and also entirely beside the point. "I am furious that you didn't trust me with the truth the moment you had the chance. I am furious that I nearly lost a month I could have spent knowing exactly who you were from the start." He reached up, cupping her face in both hands, the way he had that very first night. "But I am not furious enough to let you walk out of that door and pretend the last month didn't happen. Tell me you don't want to leave, Rosalind, and I will forgive the rest of it, in time." "I don't want to leave," Rosalind whispered, tears finally slipping free. "I have not wanted to leave since the 2nd week, and it terrified me more than the lie itself." Alexander pulled her against his chest, his arms closing around her with a fierceness that undid the last of her composure entirely. "Then we begin again," he murmured into her hair. "Properly, this time. No more secrets between us." "Agreed." "Agreed," Rosalind said, and meant it with her whole aching heart. The following weeks were not without difficulty. Lord Ashton attempted, twice, to extract further funds from Alexander under the guise of managing the scandal before Alexander's solicitor made plain, in exceedingly precise legal language, that no further sum would be forthcoming and that any attempt to publicize the substitution would be met with consequences considerably worse than embarrassment. Lord Ashton did not trouble Thornfield again. Seraphina, for her part, wrote a long, tearful letter of apology upon learning the truth had finally come out, along with news of her own quiet marriage to Thomas in Scotland. Rosalind wrote back forgiving her entirely. She found, to her own surprise, that she could not truly resent the twin sister who had, however selfishly, given her the one thing she hadn't known she wanted, a life and a husband entirely her own. Society's reaction, when the story inevitably leaked in fragments months later, was predictably vicious in its speculation and predictably short-lived in its interest. Alexander weathered it with the same unbothered steadiness he brought to everything else, publicly declaring, whenever the subject arose, that he had married precisely the Duchess he wanted and saw no reason to explain himself further to anyone. By spring, the household had settled into an easy, established rhythm entirely its own. Rosalind ran Thornfield's accounts with the same ruthless competence she'd once brought to keeping her father's household from ruin, and the estate prospered under her attention in ways it plainly hadn't in years. One evening in late April, working together in the study exactly as they had that first fateful night, Alexander set down his pen and studied her across the desk with an expression she'd come to recognize: thoughtful, a little amused, entirely fond. "I've been thinking," he said, "that we ought to hold a proper wedding. A real one, with your real name spoken this time, in front of whoever still wishes to attend." Rosalind laughed, the quiet, true laugh he'd told her, months ago, that he preferred. "You already married me twice by accident, Alexander. Once as Seraphina, and once by simply refusing to let me leave that drawing room. Must we make it 3? I find," he said, coming around the desk to draw her to her feet, "that I would happily marry you a dozen times over, provided it was always, unmistakably, you." 5 years later, the halls of Thornfield Abbey echoed with the particular chaos of two small children conducting what appeared to be a highly disorganized siege of the East Wing, armed with wooden swords and a devoted, long-suffering hound. Rosalind watched from the study doorway, a ledger balanced against her hip, as her eldest, a dark-haired girl of 4 with her father's sharp green eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, issued increasingly elaborate battle commands to her younger brother. Alexander came up behind her, smelling of horse and autumn air, and wrapped his arms around her waist. Serafina writes that she and Thomas are settling in Edinburgh permanently, Rosalind said, leaning back against him. She sends her love and asks, again, whether we've forgiven her entirely. Have we? Mostly, Rosalind said, smiling. I find it difficult to resent the one decision in my life that led me here. Alexander pressed a kiss to her temple, watching their children's small, joyful chaos unfold across the hall. Are you happy, Rosalind? He asked, a question he still asked her now and then, quietly, as though he still occasionally marveled that the truth hadn't cost him everything after all. I am the wife you were never meant to marry, she said, who turned out, by every account, to be exactly the one you needed. He laughed, low and warm, and pulled her closer, and the study doors swung shut behind them, not to hide anything this time, only because, for the first time in either of their lives, there was nothing left worth hiding at all. If Rosalind and Alexander's story, a lie that became the truest thing in either of their lives, moved you, give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a slow-burn, secret identity romance done right. Subscribe to Eternal Chapters for more full-length historical love stories where the truth always finds its way home. Let me know in the comments, would you have confessed the swap the very first night, the way Rosalind almost did, or waited, the way she actually chose to?